All right, so good morning. I'm Jason Ellis, Associate Professor of English at City Tech, and I'd like to welcome you to the 7th Annual City Tech Science Fiction Symposium, with this year's theme being SF and the Archive. In part, this year's event brings us full circle to the first symposium. When Alan Lovegreen and I worked to bring the 600 linear foot donation that inaugurated the City Tech Science Fiction Collection, our dearly departed colleague Mary Nilis exclaimed that I had to organize an event to celebrate our newly created archive of SF. The collection spurred these symposia, and now the symposium trains its lens on what the archive means for SF. Another aspect of this year's event was brought into sharp relief by an article that I read over the weekend in The Guardian by Stephen Marsh that trumpets the warrior librarians of Ukraine, whose archive materials, ranging from archaeological artifacts to birth and death records, required rapid mobilization for preservation. Their archives constitute a record, a memory, an expression of Ukrainian identity, community, and nation. As much as their soldiers are fighting for land and the preservation of Ukrainian lives, the librarians are fighting to protect and preserve the archive that in many ways defines what is Ukraine and its people. I don't want to mischaracterize the stakes at hand for us today. They are not as dire as those of the brave Ukrainian librarians, but there are stakes and stakeholders when we talk about any archive, including SF archives in our libraries, and the larger idea of how the SF archive defines what SF is, who gets to create SF, and who gets to enjoy SF. In many ways, the SF archive defines the SF community as much as the genre itself. Today, we will hear about the work in SF archives, debates about what is the SF archive, and experiences of the writers whose published work has joined the archive. And I believe that we will make important headway toward capturing the interrelationship between the SF archive and the SF community. I would like to encourage you all to participate and raise points or ask questions during the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window during each session. You see the row of tools that you have available. In general, sessions begin with introductions, followed by presentations or discussion, and conclude with a Q&A session. Use the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom webinar screen to make points or pose questions at any point during a session. The moderator will bring these to the panelists at the end of each session for answering or discussion. There's also the option to use chat for general discussion that everyone can read, or you can use it to message the hosts or panelists directly. However, please don't use the chat for questions to panelists during the session, as it's easy to overlook a question as the chat conversation pushes material off screen. Use the Q&A feature to ask panelists questions, and use the chat for general discussion and remarks during the symposium. Outside of the Zoom webinar, we are live tweeting the event from our City Tech SF Twitter account. Kel's taking care of that today. If you'd like to engage in that conversation, we are deploying the hashtags CityTechSF and SF Archive to thread together to the day's conversations. So SF Archive and City Tech SF. Before we begin, I'd like to thank Professor Mary Ann Beal and the Faculty Commons and Faculty Commons designer Or Schifflinger, who created this year's amazing symposium poster. And I would like to thank my co-organizers, Wynette Clyde, who unfortunately can't be here today for a medical emergency, Kel Karpinski from City Tech's Ursula C. Sherwin Library, and my colleagues from the English department, Jill Belay, Lee Gold, who hasn't made it yet, and Lucas Kwong. And a special thanks to you all for participating and attending this year's symposium. Next, I would like to introduce a longtime supporter of the City Tech Science Fiction Collection and Annual Symposium, Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences at City Tech, Justin Vazquez-Poritz, who would like to say a few words.
Thank you, Professor Ellis. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 7th Annual City Tech Science Fiction Symposium. I'm going to be a bit duplicative in thanks, but I think that's something that's definitely worth it. I would like to give my heartfelt thanks to all of the people who have made today's event possible. The symposium organizers, Professor Jill Belay, Wynette Clyde, Kel Karpinski, Lucas Kwong, and of course, Jason Ellis. Thank you to our presenters, panelists, moderators, and our keynote speaker, Jeremy Brett. Thank you to the authors and editors, librarians and archivists, researchers and scholars, students and faculty members, artists and musicians, and lest we forget the inventors, all of which will be in our audience today and will contribute to the dynamical discussions that will take place. A couple of days ago at a family wedding, I found myself having a conversation with guitar player Joe Satriani. We each asked each other one question about the other's work. As the physicist, I asked about the building blocks of his trade. Have all of the possible chords already been played? As the creative artist, he asked me, could the universe be inside of a wormhole? Just this brief interaction between two people represented the intrigue to try to move beyond the known boundaries. And so with our diverse audience today, I can't wait to see where the conversations will take us. By the way, Joe's answer to my question was, yes, all possible chords have already been played. Now there are efforts to go beyond Western-centric musical traditions and look at cultures in which there aren't specific notes, but instead there are continuous ranges. I think this is analogous to the intellectual diversity that we bring here today, with sessions on the Latinx multiverse, Black voices, and even an Okinawan arts archive, while at the same time saluting the one and only Asimov. This year's theme is the archive, and a celebration of CityTech's science fiction archive as well as others. It is an important question to ask. Who and how is it decided what gets included and what doesn't? To quote the symposium description, because the organizers state it much better than I could do, perhaps most exciting for the present are the many initiatives to excavate our shared cultural histories for science fiction that had been overlooked or forgotten, but certainly deserving of inclusion, such as those by writers of color, women, and LGBTQ+ persons, and efforts to bring global science fiction to wider audiences, thanks to growing networks of readers and scholars versed in the original language of a text and those wanting to experience those stories through translation. I believe that the archivists are all too often the unsung heroes, for they are the ones that better enable us to take intellectual voyages back through time, as well as plan what such voyages will be like for the readers of the future. For those of you who have been loyally with us all these years, can you believe that this is our 7th annual symposium? I'm not sure how many of us would have predicted the world we live in now, and I hope that future symposia will find us in brighter worlds. But in the meantime, the symposia has been a bright spot for me each year. In fact, I mark my years of being a dean based on it. It's been truly impressive to see how the symposium has evolved, with each annual edition having its own unique aspects. So I very much look forward to listening in on today's presentations and discussions. Thank you.
Thanks, Justin. We really appreciate that and your support. So we'll get started now. I'll begin setting up for our first paper session on archival research. Jill Belai will be moderating that. So all the presenters, I'm going to be promoting you to panelists. You can turn on your cameras, but please leave your mics muted so that there isn't any cross chatter while we get that set up. Okay, so we'll get started in just a moment. And again, thanks for everyone for being here today.